Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherrod of the 2nd Marine Division first glimpsed Betio Island through his field glasses at 0545 hours on November 20, 1943, as the pre-invasion bombardment reached its crescendo. The coral atoll of Tarawa stretched barely 3 miles long and 800 yards wide, but the 4,836 Japanese defenders of Admiral Keiji Shibasaki's Special Naval Landing Force had transformed every square yard of the 300-acre island into an interlocking network of concrete bunkers, steel-reinforced pillboxes, and underground command posts that would test American amphibious warfare doctrine to its absolute limits. The sight that would haunt Sherrod for the rest of his life was not the island itself, but what happened when 5,000 Marines of the 2nd Marine Division attempted to cross the coral reef that surrounded Betio Island at low tide. The Higgins boats that carried the assault waves of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines and 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines ground to a halt on the reef 500 yards from the beach, their shallow draft hulls scraping against coral heads that rose within 3 feet of the surface. The Marines had to wade through chest-deep water under concentrated fire from Japanese machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces that had survived the most intensive naval bombardment in Pacific War history. Admiral Harry Hill's Task Force 53 had spent 3 days pounding Betio Island with naval gunfire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers mounting guns ranging from 5-inch dual-purpose weapons to the 16-inch rifles of the USS Maryland and USS Colorado. The battleship Maryland alone fired 356 16-inch shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, at Japanese defensive positions that covered less area than a typical college campus. The heavy cruiser Indianapolis expended 902 8-inch shells, while destroyers of Destroyer Division 23 fired over 2,000 5-inch high-explosive rounds at point-blank range. But Admiral Shibasaki's defensive preparations had been designed specifically to withstand the kind of bombardment that American naval planners considered decisive. The Japanese had spent 18 months constructing bunkers from reinforced concrete and steel rails salvaged from the island's former phosphate mining operations. The main defensive positions were built with 5-foot-thick concrete walls and steel beam roofs capable of deflecting direct hits from 8-inch shells. Underground passages connected firing positions to ammunition storage bunkers, allowing defenders to reoccupy positions after bombardment ceased. The Japanese defensive plan for Betio Island represented a fundamental shift in Imperial Japanese Army and Navy doctrine from the aggressive offensive tactics that had characterized earlier campaigns to a defense-in-depth strategy designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces. Admiral Shibasaki's Special Naval Landing Force included 2,619 men of the 3rd Special Base Force and 2,217 men of the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, supported by construction battalions, labor troops, and Korean conscript workers who had been organized into combat units as the invasion threat became imminent. The weapons that defended Betio Island included 8-inch naval guns removed from Japanese warships and mounted in concrete casements, 140mm coastal defense guns positioned to engage shipping in the lagoon, 75mm mountain guns and field pieces, and dozens of 37mm anti-tank guns and 25mm anti-aircraft guns that could be depressed to fire at ground targets. But the most effective defensive weapons were the 500 machine gun positions that covered every possible approach to the island with interlocking fields of fire. Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup's 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines was designated to assault Red Beach 1, the northwestern shore of Betio Island, where intelligence reports indicated the lightest defensive preparations. But when Shoup's assault waves reached the coral reef at 0910 hours on November 20th, they discovered that the tide was 18 inches lower than predicted, stranding their Higgins boats 500 yards from shore. The Marines had to abandon their landing craft and wade through coral-studded water, while Japanese machine gunners of the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force fired from concrete positions that had survived 3 hours of concentrated naval bombardment. The carnage that followed was unlike anything American forces had experienced in the Pacific War. The 1st Battalion, 8th Marines lost 342 men killed or wounded in the first hour of the assault, as Marines struggled through the lagoon carrying flamethrowers, bazookas, and ammunition that became waterlogged and useless before reaching shore. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, attacking Red Beach 2 on the western tip of Betio Island, suffered similar casualties when their assault boats grounded on coral reefs and Japanese artillery of the 3rd Special Base Force zeroed in on Marines silhouetted against the white coral sand. Sherrod's position aboard the command vessel USS Monrovia provided him with a panoramic view of the disaster unfolding on Betio's beaches, but the radio communications he monitored from Marine units ashore told the story with brutal clarity. At 1030 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Shoup radioed, "Receiving heavy fire all along beach. Unable to advance inland. Request immediate naval gunfire support on positions 200 yards inland from Red Beach 1" 30 minutes later. Casualties mounting. Need immediate medical evacuation and ammunition resupply. Enemy positions intact despite bombardment." The Japanese defensive strategy that Admiral Shibasaki had implemented at Tarawa was based on lessons learned from the American assault on Guadalcanal and subsequent operations in the Central Pacific. Rather than attempting to prevent the landing with forces concentrated at the water's edge, the Japanese allowed the first assault waves to reach shore and then subjected them to coordinated fire from positions that dominated the entire beachhead. The result was that Marines who survived the wade through the lagoon found themselves pinned down on narrow strips of sand with no cover except occasional coconut log seawalls that provided minimal protection against artillery and mortar fire. The weapons that proved most effective in the close quarters fighting on Betio Island were not the heavy naval guns that had dominated previous Pacific battles, but portable weapons that individual Marines could employ against specific Japanese positions. The M1A1 flamethrower, with its 80-foot range and napalm-thickened fuel, became the primary weapon for clearing bunkers when explosive charges failed to penetrate reinforced concrete walls. The 236-inch bazooka, originally designed as an anti-tank weapon, proved effective against the steel doors and firing ports of Japanese bunkers when fired at ranges of less than 50 yards. But the most crucial weapon in the Tarawa assault was the M4A2 Sherman tank, specifically the 6 tanks of the 1st Platoon, Company C, 2nd Tank Battalion that were landed on Red Beach 1 during the afternoon of November 20th. The Sherman tanks mounted 75mm guns that could penetrate the concrete walls of Japanese bunkers with armor-piercing shells, and their machine guns provided suppressing fire that allowed Marine infantry to advance across open ground under cover. The tank that changed the course of the Tarawa battle was Colorado, commanded by Gunnery Sergeant William McBriar of the 2nd Tank Battalion. At 1,445 hours on November 20th, McBriar's Sherman advanced inland from Red Beach 1 and engaged a series of Japanese bunkers that had been holding up the advance of Lieutenant Colonel Shoup's infantry. The 75mm gun of McBriar's tank fired 23 rounds of high-explosive ammunition at point-blank range, collapsing the concrete walls of 3 major bunkers and allowing the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines to advance 200 yards inland for the first time since landing. The Japanese response to the Sherman tank assault demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had characterized Imperial Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War. When conventional anti-tank weapons proved ineffective against the thick armor of the M4A2 Sherman, Japanese engineers of the 3rd Special Base Force improvised explosive devices from naval shells and aviation bombs that could be detonated under the tank's tracks. The technique required individual Japanese soldiers to crawl within 20 feet of advancing tanks and manually trigger the explosives, a mission that was essentially suicidal but which succeeded in destroying 2 Sherman tanks on the afternoon of November 20th. The night of November 20th to 21st, 1943, marked the most critical phase of the Tarawa battle as Japanese forces attempted to drive the Marines back into the lagoon through a series of coordinated banzai charges. Admiral Shibasaki's plan called for simultaneous attacks by the 3rd Special Base Force and 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force against the Marine beachheads at 0300 hours, when American naval gunfire support would be limited by the difficulty of engaging targets close to friendly positions. The banzai charge that struck the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines at 0315 hours on November 21st involved over 300 Japanese naval infantry armed with Arisaka rifles, katana swords, and improvised explosive devices. The attackers emerged from concealed positions throughout the airfield area and charged across 400 yards of open ground toward the Marine perimeter on Red Beach 1. The assault was preceded by concentrated mortar fire from Japanese 90mm mortars and supported by machine gun fire from positions that had been bypassed during the previous day's advance. The Marine response to the banzai charge demonstrated the effectiveness of American small unit tactics and fire discipline that had been developed through extensive training in amphibious warfare. The defending Marines of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines held their fire until the Japanese attackers were within 50 yards, then opened with concentrated rifle fire, Browning automatic rifle fire, and grenades that created an impenetrable barrier of lead and steel. The M1919A4 machine guns of the weapons platoons fired over 2,000 rounds in 15 minutes, supported by 60 mm mortar fire that had been pre-plotted to cover the approaches to the Marine positions. But the most devastating defensive fire came from the destroyer USS Ringgold, which had anchored in the lagoon specifically to provide close gunfire support during nighttime attacks. The Ringgold's 5-inch guns fired 147 rounds of high-explosive ammunition at Japanese assembly areas behind the airfield, breaking up follow-on attacks before they could be launched. The accuracy of naval gunfire support was made possible by Marine artillery observers who had established communication with the ship during the previous day's fighting and could adjust fire in real time. The failure of the banzai charges on the night of November 20th to 21st marked the turning point of the Tarawa battle, but the cost in Marine casualties continued to mount as Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions throughout November 21st and 22nd. The 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines lost 112 men killed and 287 wounded, capturing the airfield that dominated the center of Betio Island. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines suffered similar casualties securing the eastern end of the island, where Japanese positions were concentrated around a concrete command bunker that required direct assault by flamethrower teams. The weapon that proved most effective in the final phase of the Tarawa assault was white phosphorus, delivered both by Marine mortar units and by naval gunfire from destroyers in the lagoon. White phosphorus shells created clouds of toxic smoke that forced Japanese defenders to abandon their bunkers or suffocate, allowing Marine infantry to close with flamethrowers and explosive charges. The psychological effect of white phosphorus was as important as its physical impact, as Japanese soldiers who had endured 3 days of bombardment finally abandoned positions they had held against conventional high-explosive ammunition. The final Japanese defensive position to fall was Admiral Shibasaki's command bunker, a massive concrete structure at the eastern end of Betio Island that had been built with 8-foot-thick walls and a steel-reinforced roof designed to withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval guns. The bunker was captured at 1,305 hours on November 23 by a combined assault involving Sherman tanks, flamethrower teams from the 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion, and naval gunfire from the cruiser Indianapolis firing at point-blank range from the lagoon. The statistics that emerged from the Tarawa battle were sobering evidence of the price of amphibious warfare against fortified positions. The 2nd Marine Division suffered 1,009 Marines killed and 2,101 wounded, capturing an island that measured 300 acres and could be walked from end to end in 30 minutes. Japanese casualties were even higher, 4,690 killed out of a garrison of 4,836, with only 146 prisoners taken, most of whom were Korean conscript laborers rather than combat troops. But the strategic significance of Tarawa extended far beyond the casualty figures. The battle demonstrated that American amphibious warfare doctrine could succeed against the strongest Japanese fortifications, provided that sufficient firepower, air support, and specialized equipment were available. The lessons learned at Tarawa would be applied to every subsequent Central Pacific operation, from the Marshall Islands to Saipan, Guam, and ultimately Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The tactical innovations that emerged from the Tarawa battle included the use of underwater demolition teams to clear obstacles from landing beaches, the development of specialized landing craft that could negotiate coral reefs, and the integration of close air support with naval gunfire and ground operations. Most importantly, American planners learned that pre-invasion bombardment had to be sustained for days rather than hours to be effective against reinforced concrete fortifications. Sherrod's detailed reporting of the Tarawa battle, published in Time magazine and later in his book Tarawa, The Story of a Battle, brought home to the American public the true cost of victory in the Pacific War. His description of Marines wading through blood-red water toward Japanese machine gun positions became one of the most vivid accounts of amphibious warfare ever written. The photographs taken by Marine combat photographers during the battle, showing dead Marines on coral beaches and Japanese bodies scattered among destroyed bunkers, provided graphic evidence of the price of victory against fanatical defenders. The strategic consequences of the Tarawa victory were felt immediately throughout the Central Pacific as American forces advanced toward the Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and ultimately the Mariana Islands that would provide bases for B-29 bombing raids against the Japanese home islands. The 2nd Marine Division that had captured Betio Island would go on to assault Saipan in June 1944, applying the lessons learned at Tarawa to an even larger and more heavily fortified target. But for the Marines who survived the 76 hours of fighting on Betio Island, the most important lesson was personal rather than strategic. They had proved that American amphibious forces could take any position the Japanese could fortify, regardless of the cost. The confidence that emerged from the Tarawa victory would sustain Marine units through the even bloodier battles that lay ahead in the Central Pacific drive toward Tokyo. The coral reef that had trapped Marine landing craft 500 yards from shore became a symbol of the obstacles that American forces would overcome throughout the Pacific War. But it was also a reminder that victory in amphibious warfare required not just superior firepower and equipment, but the willingness of individual Marines to wade through enemy fire when their boats could carry them no further. The concrete bunkers that had defied 3 days of naval bombardment were eventually reduced by flamethrowers, explosive charges, and the persistent courage of Marine assault teams who understood that some positions could only be taken by men willing to die in the attempt. The Japanese defenders who had held those positions until the final moment had demonstrated the same kind of courage, fighting to the death for an island that had no strategic value except as a stepping stone to more important objectives. The amphibious warfare doctrine that was tested and refined at Tarawa would become the template for American operations throughout the Central Pacific, but the human cost of that doctrine was measured in the Marine cemeteries that grew on coral islands from Tarawa to Okinawa. The 2nd Marine Division cemetery on Betio Island contained 1,009 graves, each one representing a lesson learned about the price of victory against fanatical defenders. The Japanese defensive strategy that had made Tarawa so costly would be repeated on every island in the Central Pacific, but with increasing sophistication as Japanese engineers learned to build bunkers that could withstand even the heaviest American bombardment. The result was a series of increasingly bloody battles that culminated in the slaughter on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders had perfected the defensive techniques first employed at Tarawa. But the Tarawa battle also demonstrated that American industrial capacity and tactical innovation could overcome any defensive position, given sufficient time and resources. The specialized equipment that had been improvised for the Tarawa assault, waterproof radios, tank infantry communication systems, flamethrower tanks, and reef-crossing landing craft, became standard equipment for subsequent operations, reducing casualties and increasing effectiveness. The naval gunfire support that had proved crucial in the final phases of the Tarawa battle became the model for all subsequent Central Pacific operations. The accuracy and intensity of fire from ships like the Indianapolis and Ringgold demonstrated that naval forces could provide effective close support for ground operations when proper communication and coordination procedures were established. The air support that had been limited during the Tarawa assault due to the lack of nearby airbases became a major factor in later operations as American carrier forces grew in size and effectiveness. The lessons learned about coordinating airstrikes with naval gunfire and ground operations at Tarawa were applied throughout the Central Pacific campaign, reducing the burden on Marine infantry and increasing the effectiveness of pre-assault bombardment. The psychological impact of the Tarawa battle extended beyond its immediate tactical lessons. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had demonstrated that they could take heavily fortified Japanese positions through direct assault rather than bypassing them or reducing them through extended siege operations. The confidence that this victory generated among American commanders and troops was crucial to the success of subsequent operations in the Central Pacific. The Japanese response to the Tarawa defeat was to strengthen defenses on remaining Central Pacific islands and to develop new defensive tactics designed to increase American casualties. The result was an escalating cycle of fortification and firepower that culminated in the massive defensive preparations on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese forces applied all the lessons they had learned from the Tarawa defeat. The strategic debate that followed the Tarawa battle centered on whether the casualties had been justified by the strategic gains achieved. Critics argued that the island could have been bypassed and allowed to wither on the vine, while supporters contended that the experience gained in amphibious warfare against fortified positions was essential for future operations. The debate continued throughout the war and beyond, but the tactical innovations that emerged from Tarawa were applied successfully in every subsequent Central Pacific operation. The media coverage of the Tarawa battle, particularly Sherrod's reporting and the graphic photographs taken by marine combat photographers, marked a turning point in American public understanding of the Pacific War. For the first time, Americans at home saw uncensored images of the true cost of victory against Japanese defenders who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The equipment failures that had contributed to the high casualties at Tarawa, landing craft that could not cross coral reefs, radios that failed in salt water, and weapons that jammed in sand and coral dust, led to intensive development efforts that produced improved equipment for subsequent operations. The waterproof radios, reef-crossing landing craft, and corrosion-resistant weapons that resulted from these efforts saved thousands of lives in later battles. The medical lessons learned at Tarawa were equally important, as Navy corpsmen and Marine medical personnel developed new techniques for treating combat casualties under fire and evacuating wounded personnel from contested beaches. The blood plasma, morphine, and surgical techniques that were first employed at Tarawa became standard throughout the Pacific theater. The engineering innovations that emerged from the Tarawa battle included new techniques for breaching concrete fortifications, clearing obstacles from landing beaches, and constructing temporary airfields on coral islands. The 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion that had cleared bunkers with flamethrowers and explosive charges at Tarawa became the model for specialized units that spearheaded every subsequent amphibious operation. The intelligence failures that had contributed to the Tarawa casualties, particularly the underestimation of Japanese defensive strength and the miscalculation of tide levels, led to improved reconnaissance procedures and more accurate planning for subsequent operations. The underwater demolition teams that were first employed at Tarawa became an essential component of amphibious operations throughout the Central Pacific. The logistics lessons learned at Tarawa were applied to every subsequent Central Pacific operation, as American planners developed new techniques for supplying amphibious forces across thousands of miles of ocean and maintaining them on coral islands that lacked natural resources. The floating dry docks, mobile repair ships, and supply vessels that supported the Tarawa operation became the foundation of the fleet train that sustained American operations throughout the Central Pacific. The command and control innovations that emerged from the Tarawa battle included new communication procedures, improved coordination between naval and ground forces, and better integration of air support with surface operations. The joint command structure that was first tested at Tarawa became the standard for all subsequent amphibious operations in the Pacific theater. The training modifications that resulted from the Tarawa experience included more realistic rehearsals for amphibious operations, improved small unit tactics for fighting in fortified positions, and specialized training for equipment that had proved crucial in the battle. The Marine training bases in the United States were reorganized to incorporate the lessons learned at Tarawa, producing better prepared units for subsequent operations. The cultural impact of the Tarawa battle extended beyond its immediate military significance, as American forces encountered for the first time the full implications of Japanese military culture and its emphasis on death before dishonor. The fact that fewer than 150 Japanese personnel survived out of a garrison of nearly 5,000 demonstrated the fanatical resistance that American forces would face throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The technological lessons learned at Tarawa accelerated American development of specialized amphibious warfare equipment, including improved landing craft, waterproof communications equipment, and specialized weapons for fighting in coral and sand environments. The innovations that emerged from the Tarawa experience gave American forces significant advantages in subsequent operations. The tactical doctrine that was refined at Tarawa became the foundation for American amphibious operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The emphasis on overwhelming firepower, specialized equipment, and coordinated assault techniques that characterized the Tarawa operation was applied successfully in every subsequent Central Pacific battle. The strategic momentum that was generated by the Tarawa victory enabled American forces to accelerate their advance across the Central Pacific, capturing the Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and Mariana Islands in rapid succession. The confidence that emerged from proving that Japanese fortifications could be taken by direct assault was crucial to the success of these subsequent operations. The human cost of the Tarawa victory was never forgotten by the Marines who participated in the battle or the families of those who died on the coral beaches of Betio Island. But the strategic significance of the victory, the proof that American amphibious forces could take any position the Japanese could fortify, justified the sacrifice in the context of a war that required such victories to reach its successful conclusion. The coral reef that had trapped Marine landing craft 500 yards from shore became a symbol of the obstacles that American determination could overcome. The concrete bunkers that had defied naval bombardment fell to the persistence and courage of Marines, who understood that some positions could only be taken by men willing to close with the enemy regardless of the cost. When I saw 4,500 Marines storm Tarawa's 300-acre death trap, I witnessed the birth of modern amphibious warfare and the demonstration that American forces possessed the tactical skill, technological superiority, and moral courage necessary to defeat any enemy position, regardless of how strongly it was fortified. The lessons learned in 76 hours of fighting on a tiny coral atoll would shape the remainder of the Pacific War and influence military thinking for decades to come. The sight of Marines wading through blood-red water toward Japanese machine gun positions became one of the defining images of the Pacific War, but it was also proof that American forces would pay whatever price was necessary to achieve victory. The coral beaches of Betio Island were soaked with the blood of heroes who understood that some battles could only be won by men willing to die for their country and their cause. The strategic implications of the Tarawa victory extended far beyond the capture of a single coral atoll. The battle demonstrated that American amphibious warfare doctrine could succeed against the strongest Japanese defenses, provided that sufficient firepower, specialized equipment, and trained personnel were available. The confidence that this victory generated among American commanders and troops was crucial to the success of the entire Central Pacific campaign. The tactical innovations that emerged from the Tarawa battle, the use of tank infantry teams, the coordination of naval gunfire with ground operations, and the employment of specialized engineering equipment, became standard practice throughout the Pacific theater. The blood that was shed on the coral beaches of Betio Island purchased lessons that saved thousands of lives in subsequent operations. The courage that was displayed by both American and Japanese forces at Tarawa represented the highest traditions of military service, as men on both sides fought with complete dedication to their duty and their cause. The Marines who waded through enemy fire to reach the beach and the Japanese defenders who fought to the death in their concrete bunkers both demonstrated the kind of courage that defines the warrior ethos. The memory of Tarawa would inspire American forces throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, as the Marines who had proved that Japanese fortifications could be taken by direct assault went on to capture Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The confidence that emerged from the Tarawa victory was built on the foundation of sacrifice and courage that characterized American amphibious operations throughout the Central Pacific campaign. When I saw 4,500 Marines storm Tarawa's 300-acre death trap, I knew that I was witnessing one of the defining moments of the Pacific War, the proof that American determination and courage could overcome any obstacle regardless of the cost. The coral atoll of Betio Island became a symbol of American resolve and a testament to the price that free men are willing to pay for victory over tyranny.